you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you here today, Commissioner, and good to see your family here as well. Caroline Francis is one of my favorite girls' names. We have a little girl named Caroline as well. She's now a big girl. And Emmett Joseph, that's a sharp-looking tie you're wearing there today as well. Thanks for coming to Montana last month to participate in the Kalispell telehealth workshop, where I'm sure you saw firsthand the opportunities that technology truly can bring to rural America. In your statement to the committee, you mentioned that one of your top priorities is securing access to communication services for all people, no matter where they live. And I couldn't agree more. Access to technology is allowing us to remove geography as a constraint and allows Montanans and those who live in rural areas to start and grow world-class companies. But we've still got a lot of work to do, a lot of issues to overcome to connect our unserved communities, and certainly the FCC plays a very big role in that. The Communications Act tasks the FCC with providing services to rural consumers that are reasonably comparable to services in urban areas. Now, some areas of the country are about to get 5G service, and many areas in Montana don't even know what G is right now. We'd love to see G anything. Can we really say that this is comparable service?
Thank you, Senator, for the question, and thank you for acknowledging my family. I think we have work to do. You can travel in rural America and rural Montana and know that connectivity is not yet everywhere. And we are continually adjusting, tweaking, and evolving our universal service policies to make sure that we reach those areas with more precision. That is not something we can do one time. We have to constantly be working at it, constantly identifying those areas that do not have service and making sure we direct our funds towards those areas.
What is the FCC doing to incentivize build-out and bring rural states up to comparable levels? I think it often comes down to incentives.
Senator, I agree with you. I think it is important that we use our license terms as an incentive. That license terms should be longer if you meet intermediate build-out requirements. License terms should consider build-out requirements that are specific to rural areas. We should also think about how during our auctions we auction off licenses in small enough sizes that small carriers compete. And finally, in redoing our designated entities rules recently, we created new bidding credits for providers that serve rural areas. And I think the mix of policies like that and incentives built into them, we have a chance of actually providing better service.
You've brought up the issue of spectrum, and as you know, we have plenty of spectrum in Montana. The problem is deployment.
Yes.
We have companies in Montana who want to build out infrastructure, but the spectrum they need is owned by companies that aren't using it. So I'd like to get your thoughts on what are some ways to encourage companies that have spectrum in rural areas, in rural states, to build out or at least lease the spectrum to rural providers?
Thank you. I guess this is where I'm going to give a plug to that bill that I mentioned earlier, which I think thoughtfully suggests that companies, large companies that have spectrum licenses in rural areas, to the extent they're not deploying there, should be given an incentive to lease it out to small companies that are willing to do so. And that incentive could be an extension of their underlying license.
Can you explain how the FCC determines the build-out requirements for spectrum holders? Because in a rural state like Montana, a company could meet its build-out requirements by only serving 2 or 3 small communities, but still leave 70% of the state's population unserved. So what could the FCC do to ensure build-out in the rural areas so that everyone's served?
You're right. Traditionally, I believe most of our build-out requirements have been on a population basis, which means in a vast state like Montana, you could service a handful of towns and succeed in reaching that milestone. I think the question is, can we come up with a system that is more geographic-based or road mile-based so that we can make sure service goes more places? Because people, of course, travel through those places to do their business, to move through the state, and to get to work.
We just had a situation. In fact, there was a bow hunter was attacked by a grizzly bear. I met him last week back home. It's an amazing story of survival, but it was his cell phone that probably saved his life, as he was in a pretty remote area, was able to get a signal and get help and probably save the young man's life. Last question, universal service. Many companies in Montana rely on universal service funds, but there's issues with the fund, including overbuilding as well as duplication. You mentioned the importance of universal access for all Americans. What's the FCC doing to make sure that USF funds are used to bring connectivity to unserved communities, kind of back to the same drumbeat here, rather than communities that already have access?
You're right, Senator. We've got $4.5 billion that we can make available annually for high-cost areas of this country, rural communities. We would be wasteful if we chose to continue to allow those funds to support areas where the private sector has already supplied broadband and wireless services. We are making efforts with our new Connect America Fund to make sure that if there is a private sector supplier, we no longer provide funding to those areas. We're going to have to continue to work on that because we cannot afford duplication because our funds are not infinite.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah. Thanks, Commissioner.